In this tutorial, I'm going to try to carefully describe the difference between data statements and procedure statements, which is important to understand the difference between the two when you're programming in SAS. What I'm going to do in this particular tutorial is I'm going to cover data statements. I'll mention procedure statements, but in the following tutorial, I'll run a couple of common procedures that are used to analyze data once the data has been read in. Okay, so this should look familiar by now if you've been going through these tutorials. I'm going to specify my output here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to import some data. I've showed you carefully how to import data in a previous tutorial, but let me do this real quick again. I'm going to import data using the import wizard. The data that I'm importing is a CSV file that consists of a whole bunch of financial statements from about 450 firms. I obtained this data from Compustat. So I'm going to click next here. I've got to find the file. Let's see. See, I already forgot where I put this file here. So anyway, this is the file. You can see it's called Final Accounting Statements 2019. It's a CSV file. I'm going to pull this in. So when SAS asked me, when the import wizard asked me, where's this file located, I pointed SAS to the directory and I said, this is the data set, and it's a CSV file. You can see the .csv there. I click next. It's going to create a new library called work, and under work I can name this data set whatever I want. So I'm going to name this data set data 1. Just because this is the name of the SAS data set that I'm creating that's coming from this CSV file. I click finish. You can see that in the log file here it says that this work.data1 was successfully created. It has 450 observations and 26 variables. I can look at that data set, the SAS data set, by going here to libraries under the work library, and there it is created. That's a SAS data set called data1. I can open it up there, and this is what the data set looks like. I've explained this data set in previous tutorials, but what you see here is for 450 firms, it's 2019 financial statements. Here is current assets, total assets, cash holdings, cost of goods sold, depreciation, dividends, EBIT, inventory, current liabilities, long-term liabilities, net income, revenue, taxes, interest expense. So I've got a whole bunch of variables there that I'm going to play with. What I want to do here is, I've also explained this in a previous tutorial, I want to run a procedure. I do this all the time, but I really want to look at what my data looks like in SAS. So when I say proc print, whenever I say the word proc, this is a procedure statement, and this is what I want to talk about in this tutorial. I want to talk about the difference between procedures in SAS and data steps in SAS. So whenever there's a whole bunch of pre-specified procedures that SAS will run. One of them is proc print. One of them is proc means. I can calculate the means of the mean of different data that I have. Proc reg is another procedure. I'll explain these in a later tutorial. But this is a procedure, proc print, and I have to specify the data that I want to print. So I say proc print data equals the work library dot data1. So this is my SAS data set. I don't want to print all 450 observations, so I'm only going to print the first 20. I'm going to run these first 2 lines of code. I highlight these. I've explained this in a previous tutorial as well. I click submit, and there's my data set. So this is the CSV file that I read in that is now a SAS data set. It consists of all the financial statements of 450 firms. So in this tutorial, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically, inside a data step, create a whole bunch of new data from the financial statements. So you can think of an analyst that wants to analyze a whole bunch of various financial statement ratios, do some ratio analysis on all these companies that I have in this data. This tutorial will be helpful. So again, the difference between a procedure statement and a data statement is the procedure statements are already specified by SAS. within a data statement, what I'm going to do now is a data statement. I'm going to say data2. So I'm trying to create a new SAS data set called data2. And what the SAS data set that I want to create is I want to set work.data1. So I want to take this CSV file that I've imported into SAS, which is called work.data1, and I want to create a new SAS data set called data2. And inside of this data step, and notice at the end of each line of code I'm using these semicolons, inside of this data step I want to create new variables calculating the ratios of these different accounts on the financial statements. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say, let's calculate ROE. The finance students or accounting students will remember what ROE is. ROE is equal to net income divided by total equity. Okay? So if I scroll over here, I have net income. Notice that I don't have equity anywhere, but I do have assets and liabilities. Total assets and total liabilities. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create ROE by taking net income divided by the difference between assets and liabilities, which is equity. Does that make sense? So here is ROE. I'm going to might as well create ROA, which stands for return on assets, which is equal to the ratio of net income to total assets. I can create profit margin, which is equal to net income divided by sales. Okay, so I can create some profitability ratios there. I could create, and if I wanted to name what these ratios are, I can comment out by clicking /*, and this is just comments within my code. These are profitability ratios. Okay, I might be interested in creating liquidity ratios or short-term solvency ratios. Let's see, I could create the current ratio, which is equal to current assets divided by current liabilities. I could create the quick ratio, which the accountants that are listening will remember that that's going to be the difference between, I basically take out inventory. So it's current assets minus inventory divided by current liabilities. And I could create the cash ratio, which is just cash holdings divided by my current liabilities. So I've created liquidity ratios. I could create some debt ratios. My debt to equity ratio would be total liabilities divided by the difference between total assets and total liabilities, which is, again, in the denominator here, that's equity. Okay, so I've created the debt to equity ratio. I could create the debt to assets ratio. So there's a few debt ratios that I could create. And I could also create some efficiency ratios. Okay, remember when I'm talking about efficiency, or when somebody in an accounting or finance class is talking about efficiency, they're going to be calculating asset turnover ratios. So total asset turnover is going to be equal to sales divided by assets. That's telling us for every dollar of assets how many sales the firm generates. I could do fixed asset turnover. Here, fixed asset turnover is going to be sales divided by fixed assets. Notice that I don't have fixed assets up here. I just have total assets and current assets. So I'm going to take the difference as fixed assets. That's telling me for every dollar of fixed assets how many sales I generate. So I can create profitability ratios, liquidity ratios, and debt ratios. I'm going to print this new SAS data set called data2. I only want to see 20 observations. I'm going to highlight that those lines of code. Click submit. And as I scroll over here, there are all of my new variables. Okay. Here are my profitability ratios. Here are my liquidity or short-term solvency ratios. Here's my debt to equity and debt to assets ratio, my long-term solvency ratios, and here are my efficiency ratios. Okay. So hopefully this is useful. Again, the point of this tutorial is to show you what you can do within a data step. You can create new variables from the existing SAS data that you've already pulled in, and the difference between a procedure statement. Okay. In the next tutorial, I'll go through some various procedures using the data that we just created during this data step and show you some of the common procedures that we'll use.